Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second webinar in the RESPACC project. I'm Daniela Moshoiu. I'm an associate professor in University Transylvania, partner in RESPACC. RESPACC comes from research for palliative competencies for palliative care clinicians. And the aim of this project is really to bring research in our clinical daily practice. I'm very happy to introduce the two speakers and who will lead our webinar today, Professor Sheila Payne. She is from University of Lancaster, and Dr. Stephen Mason from University of Liverpool, both of them working in this project under the umbrella of EAPC. Welcome, and I hope we'll have a very good interactive discussion.
So thank you, Daniela, for your kind introduction. So welcome, everybody. Stephen and I are going to host this webinar. We're going to start by having a dialogue between us about the process of actually thinking about publishing your research and how you do that. Now, Stephen's very experienced in publishing, and it will be really interesting to hear his views. And for both of us, we're going to talk very honestly about the things that we find difficult, as well as the things that we enjoy about publication. We've also collated your queries and questions, both before Catherine Walsh's talk yesterday, and also during the talk. And we're going to spend some time trying to answer or at least talk about some of those points that you kindly made. Now, during this, you might have some other ideas or queries that you have. And please feel free to put them either in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll keep an eye on those and try and answer them if possible, or at least think about them. And if necessary, we can always send them back to Catherine and get her views. So I'm going to start now by asking Stephen, can you tell me what you do first when you're starting to think about publishing one of your research projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess in truth, the thoughts around publishing should come very early in the start of your research project. And really when you have got your research project and your proposal, and almost before you're collecting data, you should be thinking about what are the potential papers that you want to publish and what are the results that you want to share from your study. That should be the plan, but often what happens is you will come to the end of your project and you might have a slightly different set of data or a slightly different set of results than you initially thought. And you do then need to think about, well, what is it that within the project that you want to disseminate? So it's good to have a plan around publication, a publication plan, just as you would have an analysis plan for the data, but it's preparing to be flexible with that. And I think if you were able to watch the seminar yesterday from Catherine Walsh, one of the things she mentions is avoiding salami slicing. So when you have a project, it's making sure that you are not reporting parts of it which are too small to stand as an individual paper, that you need to think, well, sometimes we think here, what is the big paper? What is the big paper that we want to publish? And then what other papers do we think are actually useful for the academic community? So thinking about a publication plan, and that's whether it's a very large, complex project with multiple parts to it, or a small, discrete project, it's really useful to try and think of that ahead of time. The other thing that we try to think of here is also the writing team. So this is always a team effort. And although sometimes the burden can fall on one person, it should be a team process, because again, what we try to do here is we try to involve junior researchers and more seasoned researchers so that there's a collaborative approach within that. And particularly if a junior researcher is taking the lead in writing a paper, and we try to make sure that there's a good mentoring process involved so that they don't feel isolated with it and that they feel sufficiently motivated and supported, because it is quite a task when you're starting off writing and thinking about, as we were discussing earlier, about trying to write clearly and trying to communicate simply. It's difficult skill. There's some really fantastic paper writers, and the ones I enjoy the best are those who write very simply and very clearly, and that papers that you could give anybody to read and they would make sense of it. But that's a really difficult skill. So thinking about your writing team and who can support you, and I think that's particularly important for the international audience as well. If English isn't your first language, then who is there that may be in your research team that can provide that, or can you ask a favor from colleagues overseas who will help you with this? And most people will try to be helpful with that kind of process. So thinking about your writing team is really important, and thinking about peers who can support that too. The other thing I would say as well is it's always really useful to think about the reporting guidelines early on. Catherine mentioned in her talk yesterday about the Equator Network and the reporting guidelines that are around for different types of papers. Not every type of paper is covered in the Equator Network, but most of them are. But it's really useful to become familiar with those reporting guidelines so that when you're thinking about writing, you have a process that can help provide that framework or skeleton around the paper that you're starting to write. So even before you put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, there's lots of steps to kind of put in place before you then start to kind of move the words out. So that's kind of what we do here. So I guess, Sheila, in terms of that's part of the process, but when we're forming our journal, how do you choose what journal you're going to submit your paper to? What do you do around that?
Okay, thanks, Stephen. I mean, it sounds like you have a very well-developed process in your team, so well done for that. So how do I choose a journal? Well, the first thing is I try and be realistic, and also I don't just choose one, I choose three, because I'm a bit of a pessimist, you know, and I don't assume that I'm going to get into the first one that I go for. So when I make a list, and maybe I have at the top of the list an aspirational journal, a journal I really like to get into, but I'm not kind of sure if either I've got good enough data or analysis, or the project's sufficiently robust to get into that. And then I'll have the next one down. And if you say work in the area of palliative care, there are lots of journals out there, so don't feel that you have to put everything into the same journal. I'm also trying to be realistic, so I don't have as top of my list the New England Journal of Medicine, which is kind of like the top journal in medicine. I've only ever once published in the Lancet. So I think let's try and be realistic. And some people spend a lot of time and effort trying to craft a paper that would go into these really big, high impact journals. And really you're wasting your time. So talk to your colleagues, talk to your team in the way that Stephen suggests, but be realistic. So have journal number one. Journal number two, which maybe is not quite so prestigious as journal number one, but is maybe realistic and is in the same area. And then journal number three, that kind of, if you don't quite get into the other two, and that saves you feeling really disappointed when you get a rejection letter from journal number one. I just kind of say, oh, well, that's all right, I've got journal number two already lined up. But so that's kind of how I do it. And I also think really carefully about who am I communicating my project to? So is it because I want to help practitioners? And if so, then I make sure that I go into a practice-orientated journal. Or is it because I want to increase the body of knowledge for researchers? Then I make sure that it goes to a research-focused journal. If it's about policy, then I'll make sure it goes. Also, let's be realistic. We should also be communicating with patients and families. So sometimes I don't even go to an academic journal. I would want to make sure that I communicate with patients, because they need to know maybe some message that I have. So that's how I think about these things, Stephen. I'm not sure if that's the same for you. But my next question to you, Stephen, is once you've decided on a journal, what's the next thing that you do in preparing your paper for submission?
Yeah, no, I think those are great points, Sheila. And I think actually that last point you talked about, the audience, is really one of those things that we then think about in terms of preparing for submission. It's really important to think who you're communicating to and who you want to read this and what effect you want your paper to have. So that audience is a really, and you can get that from looking at the journals and seeing their kind of the meter they have in terms of how people write to them. So when we're kind of preparing the paper, again, it's back to the reporting guidelines. Again, it's really key. More and more journals are looking for authors to reference these and to structure their papers according to them. And again, really at this stage, it's about little tips from experience that stop you getting blocked at the first hurdle. And so that's one of them, is the reporting guidelines. The other is just to please make sure that you check the author guidelines within each journal, because they're all, it's one of the frustrating things as a researcher. I see so many tweets and comments in different social media saying that should be one standard format that you can write your paper for and you can then submit it to, but they all have their own idiosyncrasies, and you really need to make sure that you follow the author guidelines. And they're not entertaining to read and they're often quite long, but it's really important that you go through those systematically and you make sure that your paper is formatted according to those, because the second thing is planning. It takes a long time to write a paper, and it can often be quite frustrating when you finish your study that actually it can be 3-4 months, even longer sometimes, before your paper is ready for submission. And then actually to submit it, and then for it to get sent back to you 4 to 6 weeks later because of a simple formatting error or a simple, you've not followed this in the guidelines, is really frustrating. And as an author, you feel the clock ticking from the currency of your research to when you want to get this out. And God forbid that someone else publishes the same thing that you're doing is before you get that out. So planning is really important as well in terms of thinking of the time frames around when you're hoping to have your paper published. So yeah, thinking about the audience, thinking about the guidelines, the creator guidelines again, thinking of making sure that you follow the author submission guidelines is really, really important. Planning it out so you have time frames. Again, it can be a difficult skill to write, and it can be a difficult discipline to write frequently. So having some timelines and having some targets for writing is really helpful to, lots of people work different ways. I'm quite a pressure worker. So if I have a deadline, it focuses me to work. I'm not good at just doing it systematically. So again, knowing the skills within your team and their strengths and what works is also really kind of helpful for that. In writing it as well, it is really important to think about your audience. And if you're writing for an international journal, as Catherine was saying yesterday, write for an international audience. It might be a study that you've conducted locally, but what are the lessons for the wider, the wider community that may be useful? So you do need to think about that international audience. And the other thing I think with your writing team is that when you're coming towards the end of your paper, it's really helpful to have someone a peer or a colleague or someone who's removed from your paper available to review it. Because when you write, you become concept blind. You know what you want to write in a sentence. It makes complete sense to you, but often it can be gobbledygook. And so having someone with fresh eyes, that you might want to give them a bottle of wine and say, can you read this for me, please? And as a favor, and give them the wine after they've read the paper, not before, because that can cause problems. But also as well, if you have public and patient representation in your project group, have someone from the public, that community read it, because again, papers should be written in a way that it can be understandable. Not all of the science may be understandable, and technical statistical knowledge may not be understandable, but the core concepts should be communicable. And if, again, it's a really good thing to have a peer, but also, it could be a family member or someone who, again, you may have quite a lot of wine to give away to kind of get your paper published, but again, someone else who can read it. And again, they should be able to then tell you back the core principles of your paper, what it was about, what was found, what the impact of that was. And if they can't do that, you need to go back and review your paper before you submit. So those are kind of steps I would think that we would try to kind of put in place, and planning is always key. Okay, so we've done that now. We've got our paper, we've given away our bottles of wine, and we've got our peer and our PPI review for our paper. Submitting the paper, what happens next then, Sheila?
Okay, I'm going to first of all answer a question from Daniela, which is, how do you know what journals are, what's their target? Now, all journals, if you go to their websites, will have a mission statement. It's usually a little paragraph, and it says what this journal is aiming to do, and that should cover that it publishes for clinicians, or it publishes for the research community. The other thing it often will tell you is, it only publishes reviews. Well, then it's no point putting your empirical paper in there. Or if it only publishes clinical trials, once again, no point putting your qualitative paper in. So, like Stephen says, read carefully, not only the instructions for authors, but the kind of mission statement. What is this journal aiming to do? Because in most fields, particularly in healthcare, there's a whole range of journals, and we're quite lucky like that. But it does mean that you need to target carefully your journal so it matches your paper with the journal, because otherwise it just bounces back. So I'm going to now move on to Stephen's really important question. What happens next if you're going to submit? The other thing we haven't mentioned is the letter. A letter to the editor should accompany your wonderful manuscript that you've worked on so hard. You've checked the English, you've had it proofread, you've made sure that the referencing is in exactly the right style and that nothing is missing and there's no typos in there. So you've got it as beautiful as possible, and you're all good to go and submit that paper. And then you suddenly remember that you haven't written the letter that goes with it. And so you say, dear Professor Walsh, I've written this lovely paper, and then you click the button. Now that is not going to be enough. So my suggestion is that you think carefully. That letter shouldn't be very long, and shouldn't repeat your whole paper. So don't tell them everything that's in the paper, but tell them why your paper might be of interest to the journal. And usually you do that by saying something like, we have some new, very exciting findings from Romania about how palliative care is delivered in home care contexts, which will be of interest to your international readers because of reasons Y, Z, and X, and so on. So give them the key message from your paper by all means. And the other thing that I often try and do is I will look at what are some recent publications in that particular journal, and I'll try and make a link. One is it flatters the journal editor because they think their journal is terribly important because it's produced lots of exciting new evidence about the topic, but it also shows that your paper will build. So I'll write something like, you know, we have been very interested in the debate from Mason about how palliative care should be delivered in home care in the UK and Ireland. And we're wanting to contribute our new paper from a Romanian perspective, which shows that the way we do it in Romania is so much better. So I wouldn't quite write it like that, but that's the kind of thing. So I show that my paper builds on what they've already published and is likely to be of a great deal of interest. And I would also state that I haven't already submitted the paper to any other journals at this time. And that's quite important. So you cannot send your paper to 3 different journals at the same time. I know I said 3 journals, but you do it sequentially, not at the same time. So having got all of that right, and to make sure that there isn't some simple error like you've put an abstract in of 200 words and they wanted 300, or usually it's the other way around. I've written 500 words and they want 300, because if so, it'll just come straight back and they'll ask you to cut it. And after you've heaved a sigh of relief and you think, thank goodness that's off my desk, to get it back immediately is very, very disappointing. What happens in reality is that the paper will go to usually some screening, what are called screening editors, and they will see and ask the question, does this paper fall within the remit of this journal? So they will check your paper and your key messages against whatever the mission statement, that text that they've written on the website. So does it fulfill the requirements? Or is it, like Catherine said, she gets papers that have nothing to do with palliative care to the journal. And that means she will send them straight back. Then the editors will make sure that it fulfills the requirements, that in terms of the formatting, the length. If it says 3,000 words and yours is 7,000, it will come straight back to you. And that is particularly difficult, I know, for PhD students who have just worked for years and years to produce a fantastic thesis. And they are really upset about the prospect of cutting their life's work down to what they feel is a very short paper. But you need to do that. So if you go through all of that criteria and the screening editor thinks, yeah, there's something in here, we haven't already published something that is immediately saying the same message, it looks like a robust study, then they will send it out to review. And most reviewers, most of that will be 2 to 3 reviewers. Now, the process of reviewing has undergone some changes in recent years. So it used to be completely anonymous. And indeed it is in some journals like Palliative Medicine. While in other journals, particularly the online-only journals, you will see that it's open reviewing now, or the reviewers have a choice whether it's open or not. And I've just been publishing a paper with some colleagues in another journal, which is an even more interesting development from open review. And that's kind of like an open dialogue with the reviewer. So they suggest what needs to be changed in your paper, you do some changes, then they suggest some more, then you do some more changes. And it's all a completely open process. It does take a long time. So I can see some advantages of it, but I also see disadvantages. So that's the kind of what happens once your paper gets submitted. So I'm going back to Stephen now and saying, Stephen, well done. Your paper has been reviewed. Now, you might have had to wait a few weeks or even months for that. And you've now got some comments back from the editors and the reviewers. And I'm going to suggest that you've got 3 different reviewers and an editor's set of comments. And that goes to usually about 4 to 5 pages worth of material that you have to read. So how do you deal with that?
Yes, it's always interesting having reviewers' comments. Now, it's fantastic when you get very, very occasionally, you get comments saying, this is a fantastic paper. We highly recommend this for journal X, Y, and Z. We have nothing really further to add. That's very, very, very rare because the people who'll be reviewing your paper will be experts in the field. And they often bring really, really helpful insights into your paper and can make your paper so much stronger and better. But it's hard not to take these comments personally, and it's hard not to be frustrated by them as well. It's real effort to write papers, and when you put it in, it's almost something of you in it as well. It's quite a, it feels quite, it can feel quite a process where you feel judged by your peers, but it's not a judgment, it's a contribution, and it's hard to try and flick that switch from seeing it as a judgment to actually to something which is there to make your paper stronger. So it's a real great advantage, just as you would do in the planning process of having a peer or a colleague review your paper. This is a similar type of process. It can be tricky because the comments may be brief and maybe to the point, and that again can seem sometimes a little sharp, but it's really, you have to almost think that if a reviewer didn't think the paper was worthwhile at all, you wouldn't get those comments back. So there is, they see something of value in it and have taken the time and effort to provide these comments in a way to try and help you. Now, very occasionally there are some comments which may be not expressed in the most supportive terms, but again, you have to think that someone's taking the time and effort to do this. So they have put an investment into your paper, and you have to try and think of that as an opportunity for development. When you have those comments, it's really useful then to go back to your team and circulate them amongst your writing team or your mentor if you're being mentored, and have a discussion about the comments before you start thinking about what you're going to do with them. So again, it's almost like a step 2 of your paper. It's like another draft. And what you should then try and do is have an approach that you systematically work through the comments and think about them in terms of, 1, what does this mean for your paper in terms of any amendments that you would make? And then secondly, how you're going to explain what you're doing in relation to the comments to the editor. So when you receive your paper, you'll be asked to respond to the comments, and normally that's through track changes in your paper or highlighting changes within your paper, but you also need to provide an explanation as to why you've done what you've done, so that there's a transparent process in terms of doing that. And that's really helpful to have that from a team perspective, because you'll have many different skills within your team. And again, there may be people within your team who are maybe better able to respond to a particular type of reviewer comment than you might be. So again, it's really a team process. It's really important as well that you address all the comments that are provided, and that you provide a feedback to the editor on the comments that are made. But again, as Catherine said in her talk yesterday, the reviewer's comments are comments and suggestions. They're not absolutes. And if you have a different perspective on a comment that is made, or if you don't agree with a comment, it's really important that you articulate that back to the editor, but you provide a rationale why you think what you've written originally should stand as it is. And again, that was something I didn't learn until about probably my third or fourth paper, that actually you can respond to reviewers' comments and actually have a discussion and a dialogue with the editor. So the editor is the ultimate arbiter, usually, on those points. So you will be making a case in regards of the reviewer's comments. If you also have comments from the editor as well, those are really important to pay attention to, because they're the rate limiting step. So it's not that their comments will be better or worse than the other reviewers' comments, but those are really important to make sure that you address and you think carefully of, and you explain the steps in your process in terms of how you've amended your paper in relation to those, or again, why you think that your paper the points that you've made are appropriate. And again, it may be that you then begin a dialogue with the editor around those points, but that's generally the process that we would engage with, to think about how you respond to those reviewers' comments. And every paper has reviewers' comments. There are some, I think, we get told the story here in one of the writing sessions that we've had in Liverpool of a researcher who submitted his paper to the New England Journal that Sheila was talking about earlier 12 times, went through 12 iterations of the paper because they were determined that they were going to have their New England Journal paper published. So it can be a process, a lengthy process that you go through. And obviously there may be time limits on the currency of your data, but it's sometimes a process that it can take one, sometimes two, maybe even sometimes three iterations if you're really keen to have your paper published in a particular journal and you get comments back. You have the opportunity of developing that. So once you've gone through the comments then, Sheila, and you send that back in, what do you do if your paper then gets rejected by the editor?
Well, I weep for a bit, Stephen, and I feel very cross at the world and so on. So the first one is we recognise that everybody has an emotional response to this, and I feel really sorry for people at early stages of their careers doing their PhDs or new researchers, and it can feel very harsh when you've done all of that work. So believe me, I have lots and lots of experience of rejection, so it's not new, but it is still painful. So the first thing is, I think, is whether the rejection is immediate. If the rejection is immediate, I usually then very rapidly put the paper back into my second or my third list of journals. And I assume then it's either because they've published, you know, the journal is just not the right one for this particular paper. If the editors have taken, I will always ask for feedback, even if it's very immediate. And I'll always take account of it. So if they send me feedback that, you know, I haven't explained the methods, I haven't justified why I did a survey instead of an interview study, then I will add more detail on that. And they will point out things that I've completely omitted. I think Catherine said in one paper she forgot to say what her sample was. Or I just have not explained very well why I used a particular standardized measure. I will add that in, or I've muddled somehow up the references and it doesn't read very well. So I will make those corrections. I will also do what Stephen says, is look then before I send it to the second journal to make sure I once again have gone through checking that it's in the right style, the right referencing, the right number of words in the abstract and so on. So it's not immediately sending to, And I know from Catherine, she gets lots of papers which even has the name of the previous editor in the covering letter. So please make sure that once again, you rewrite your covering letter for your new journal. However, if it's rejected after a very detailed review in the way that Stephen has said, that's once again also very upsetting. But I will then spend time, and what I do when I look at reviewers' comprehension, I get a pen and I underline all of the points that I think that they're making, so that I can make sure that I've addressed every single one. And I will go back and say, okay, is the paper got a clear enough message? And I often talk to students about a key message. And I make people have one sentence message. So in one sentence, tell me what your new research has found. And I learned this when I went on a course by the editor of the BMJ, and the BMJ is a very prestigious journal. And he said, you have to have one clear message and only one. If you've got 6 messages, that's too many for one paper. So I will once again go back, and I'll also think, is the message in this paper not really for academics, but really for clinicians? Then I will change the journal that I'm focusing on, or change the message in the discussion. So is the whole of the paper coherent? Maybe I've started out with one question, but by the time I've got to the discussion, because I've written it 3 months later, I'll be answering a different question. So you need to make, so I'll go back really, really carefully and critically looking at the paper before I resubmit. But I think virtually always there is a journal waiting for your paper out there. So don't be discouraged. You have to adapt it each time, and that takes time and energy. But don't give up. Be resilient, and be determined. Determined that your piece of work, if it's good enough, will get out there and will get published. So I think, Stephen, that's the kind of discussion that we had planned, but I think there are going to be some questions in the chat that we need to talk about next. So shall we look at some of those and try and address them?
Yeah. So there's a question from Melina which says, so how does a junior researcher find out the range of existing journals so that they can decide on the appropriate one for potentially accepting a type of article? So I guess it's looking at the range of journals. I guess my kind of thought and comment on that is that what your research project is and where you've got your literature review at the beginning of your paper will present you the type of art journals that are publishing in this type of material. So you already have a sense of what journals are interested in this field already, and that's really the best kind of place to start, is the literature review. And whether that's a systematically structured review or whether just more of a kind of narrative review at the start of your paper, that's really a good place to start thinking about, well, having a look at those journals and seeing, and again, I think as Sheila said, it's really useful having a look at the journals online in terms of their mission statements and what they claim that they're looking for, but also looking through 3 or 4 editions of the journals to see what types of papers they are producing, because you sometimes occasionally will have a paper that's a little bit out with the norm for that journal. So you just want to check that actually the journal that you, so say it's looking at, you know, dry mouth and palliative care patients, and that's what your study is looking at, then you might find a paper from the Journal of Patient Education and Counselling. Now that's normally not what they would look at, but there may be a paper in there which is someone's particularly wanted. So having a look at a number of 3 or 4 editions of that journal and seeing what type of themes and what types of articles that they produce will give you a sense, actually, is this a natural home for this type of paper. So that's kind of what I think I would probably do. Sheila, would you do some other?
Yes, and don't be afraid to ask colleagues. So at the moment, I and a colleague are developing some work around palliative care for prisoners, and we're particularly interested in deaths in custody. So people who are in the prison system or in the remand system who die. Now, and what we're going to do is try and publish actually in a criminology journal rather than a palliative care journal. And I've never published in a criminology journal. So what we've gone to is a lecturer in criminology who publishes, and it's really invaluable to get their advice, because there's a whole range of different journals and they're familiar with what is their kind of views and the hidden agenda, as it were, in the different ones, and also the kind of how much they like. Do they like a really long introduction? Do they like a really long method section? So don't be afraid to ask colleagues who are experienced in publishing in the journal that you're thinking of publishing in, but you have less experience in. So I think let's look at another question, which is, are there academic journals, especially for patients? Well, not that I'm aware of. When I talked about publishing for patients and families, I think you need to go outside of academic journals, which is a bit beyond this talk. But for example, in the UK, there's a magazine called Saga, which is particularly for older people. And one of my interests is palliative care for older people. And I think it shouldn't be the top of your list for publishing, but it should be within your list, is to think about how do we make sure the work that we're doing is not just communicated to health professionals and other researchers, but how do we make sure that it's accessible to the public, to patients? And that may mean writing in a really different style, or using other medium like blogs or Facebook and so on. So that's another talk, I think, Stephen, but is worthwhile thinking about, because our research is more than just for other researchers.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And often larger projects, so if you're involved in a larger project that has funding, so in the UK now, it's usually a requirement that you have a dissemination plan of your literature that actually makes sure that you inform the general public about what you're doing. But that isn't always the case, but it's always a good idea to try and think about how you both for the clarity of communication in terms of your writing, but actually how you communicate that to the wider public knowledge. Another thing I would just say as well about journals is that I have previously, and sometimes will write to an editor if I'm not sure about whether my paper fits, to see if they're interested. And again, that can save you some time. I mean, editors will be incredibly busy and have many emails to go through. So again, it's almost like your letter, a short précis of what you're doing. And that can be quite helpful in them saying, actually, no, and it saves you those wasted 4 to 6 weeks sometimes of having your paper sent somewhere that it's not going to land. So another question in the chat is, so how do you organize your references and what software would you recommend? It depends where you are. So often if you're part of an institution, like an academic institution, they may have access to a certain type of referencing software. So in Liverpool, we have EndNote, which we use. But there are Mendeley is a referencing software which is freely available, and anybody can download that, and it's excellent. And again, it's one of the things we always tell our students is the first thing to do is learn how to use your referencing software, because there is nothing worse than you having to edit a paper, and if you're trying to adjust your references manually, that's just So Mendeley there may be others, but Mendeley I know is freely available. So again, that is one that I think I would recommend.
Thanks, Stephen. We've also got some a helpful link here from Eduardo about finding journals online. Jane, I've never heard of Jane, so thanks for posting it there, and maybe people will have a look on the link and see whether it's useful for them. I think Daniela also raises an important point, is that for many people going into English language journals, writing for English language journals, English will not be their first language. Now, journals vary, but they all will require kind of good or English that's understandable. Many journals will provide some sort of a copy editing that will help people. But if the paper is written in such a way that it's hard to understand, that won't help the reviewers. So what are the strategies? Well, one strategy is that you pay for English language editing before you submit. And I know that some very large research groups in, say, Belgium and the Netherlands and so on would employ people specifically to do that. The other thing to do is to have a native English speaker as part of your team, particularly if you're working in an international project, and maybe part of their role would be to help with the English language editing. But bearing in mind that, you know, that's quite a lot to ask them to do in addition to the other work that they'll be doing. So I think there are strategies to help. But having said that, I think you need to make sure it's clear, clearly understood and concisely written. And I've had the privilege of being involved in many international PhD students. And some of the very best English that I've seen written has been from students who are not native English speakers. So I think it's not just people who are not native English speakers who struggle with writing English, but many people do, including people who are born and brought up in English-speaking countries. So I think those are some strategies. The other thing I should mention is be aware if the journal that you're sending your paper to is UK English or US English. So we share what sounds like a similar language, but in fact is very different in the spellings, in some of the sentence structure and so on. And there are default word spell check positions that you can put in, but that's the other thing I would change. So if I've sent my paper to a UK English journal like Palliative Medicine, and then I want to send it in my next choice to a US English journal like the Journal of Palliative Medicine, I will change the English. Okay, Stephen, should we look at some of the pre-seminar questions that came up?
Yeah, we've got so some of the questions that were sent yesterday so the first one was about tips on the review process and how to respond to reviewers' comments. So I think we've covered that. The next question was how much time is acceptable between data collection and publication? I know that's a really good question, but a very tricky question to answer. I would say that if you've got data which is maybe 18 to 24 months old, it's probably within the bounds of data it's getting to the edge of acceptability. But I think would be to clarify, that was when actually a letter to the editor would be really helpful in saying, we have this data that we want to publish, but we're a little concerned about its currency. Now, you do get lots of papers which are secondary data analysis, and actually, so data can be used over a number of years, but there is no hard and fast rule. And the way to check that would just be writing to the editor and say, you know, my data is actually, you know, it's 5 years old, this data that we've collected, but we still think it's current. And you would need to make an argument as to why you think that data is current and of valuable value to the editor, and allow them an opportunity to say, well, yeah, let's have a look at your paper and we can make a decision from there. So that's when it can be really useful to then write to the editor. I don't know, Sheila, have you any other thoughts on that?
Yes, I think you're right. I would say normally 5 years, and I have had, particularly for PhD students who may be doing their PhD part-time, you know, they've had queries or rejections because their data is older than 5 years. So it doesn't, your data does not last forever. So do try and get it published in a timely way. Unless you're doing secondary data analysis, and that means that you come in with a different question of the data that you or somebody else collected, and then it's acceptable. But you would have to justify why this data is still relevant.
Yeah.
I think the other question we had was that any advice on carrying out scoping reviews in palliative care. I think that's maybe a little beyond this webinar. There are books published on how to do different types of reviews, and scoping review is a very useful methodology and technique. So I would suggest that you look at a book like Helen Aviard's book on postgraduate, a guide to postgraduates on how to do literature reviews. And there's a second edition of that published recently. So that may be useful for you. And then there was another question, is what literature review opinion criteria do journal editors consider for publication? I think that means literature reviews is a formal methodology, and you need to justify the type of literature review that you've selected, and it needs to be compatible with your review question and the available sources of evidence within the topic that you're reviewing. So that's, I think, my answer to that question. Do you want to answer any expand on that, Stephen?
Yeah, I think there are useful guides to help you with this. So again, from the Equator Network, looking at the PRISMA guidance on reporting of those different types of review formats is really helpful. So for the scoping reviews, there's a PRISMA for scoping reviews as well. So, but their reporting guidelines, as Catherine kind of is really keen to point out, the reporting guidelines, they're not methodology guidelines, but they're helpful to review if you're thinking about your methodology, because you know these are the points. So although they're not methodology guidelines, it's very useful to think about them when you're thinking of your methodology. I would also say that it certainly, although it may be quite UK focused, I think it's kind of has wider impact. The Cochrane Review website in the UK has a number of video seminars on different types of reviews and reviews that can be done, short 15-20 minute videos, which are really helpful for thinking about sequencing and structuring different review types. So again, that's a really useful resource that I think would probably be helpful for thinking about what types of review that you want to engage with, because there's so many different umbrella reviews now is a new type of review I learned about yesterday, actually. So yeah, scoping reviews, narrative reviews. So having a look at the Cochrane site might be quite helpful with that.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so we got another one which is about advice on non-empirical research, and I think that is a really good question, and it's much harder to publish theoretical papers or papers that have looked particularly at developing methodology. Interestingly, palliative medicine is now going to have a new section on methodological papers, and certainly my colleagues and I are in the process of trying to prepare a paper for that. We'll see whether it gets published or not. But that is much harder. And I think, once again, I'd go back to saying, are you choosing the right journal? So some journals are very much about looking at methodology. So qualitative health research, for example, is really interested in methodological developments in that area. And there would be journals in ethics and other areas that are very much about constructing detailed theoretical discussions. So please look at journals and the mission statement, because some of them may be solely interested in that much more theoretical discussion that you have, and the structure of those will be different. It's about the quality of argument that you produce. You want to look at we've got a few minutes left. You want to look at another question, Stephen?
Yeah, there's so it may be related to that question, but it's the question saying advice in constructing and submitting non-original research pieces. I think the other thing to do with that is look at what's been written previously as well. What I think for junior researchers, looking at what's been published and not using it as a template, but using it as a guide, and that again, that will let you see what the journal is kind of looking for in terms of the material and the style of writing and the types of discussion and conclusion that are being made. So do your background reading and examining what similar types of papers, you know, if it's looking at spiritual issues, for example, how those have been handled, or ethical issues, how those have been handled, and it will give you a sense of style and format and help you thinking about how you might then articulate the issue that you're looking at. Is really useful way to do that.
We also had another question yesterday about journals have usually a word limit. Now, not all of them. If you go to some of the online only journals, they can be much longer papers if you want to publish there. But in the print journals, they almost invariably have quite a tight word limit, particularly in medical health related journals. And there is absolutely a balance. And what I got wrong, when I started to write journals, is I would start by writing the introduction. And of course, I knew lots about the introduction because I was into the literature. So I write, you know, like 2,000 words on the introduction, which only gave me about 100 words for the methods and a few words for the results, and hardly anything for discussion. And I think that's not the right way round. So I always now start by writing the method section, which sounds crazy because it's the middle, then the results, then the introduction, and then the discussion. And that kind of feels to me the right way round. Now, it may not be the right way round for you, and then the abstract last. But I think that allows you to get the balance and stops you writing lots and lots and lots about an area that you feel very comfortable writing about with the introduction. And the introduction, I think, is normally 3 paragraphs. I would normally say a page. And it's much shorter than most of you will think is what you would like to write. So, Stephen, we're kind of coming to the end now of this session, and it's been fascinating hearing all of your insights. Thank you so much for sharing everything. And I've learned a lot in the process, and I'll try and go away and use it to write better papers in future. And I hope everybody who's been part of this seminar has also found it useful and enjoyable. The RESPACC project will be offering some more webinars, and the focus of our next 2 webinars will be on journal clubs, and we hope that you'll be able to join us. They're going to be in late March, early April, with some great speakers, and Stephen is going to be involved in one of them again. So thank you, Stephen. And I'll just hand you back to Stephen to say the final goodbyes.
Yeah, so I hope people have gotten some helpful hints and tips from what we've discussed today. Again, reach out to your colleagues. If you're a junior researcher, it can seem very, very daunting, this process, but reach out to your colleagues, because we've all been there at that starting point where it seems like there are just walls and hurdles, and knowing how to navigate them is not something that can be often very clear. So rely on your colleagues and ask up, and people will generally be interested. They'll be interested that you've asked them as well, because it's quite flattering that someone says, can you help me with this? And because you've got this knowledge. So that can be quite nice to do, but don't be shy about asking up or asking for support. These things are always collaborative and community types of efforts. So, and I just say, yeah, and encourage you to go for it, you know, so that do all the work in your research, and it's a real shame that a lot of data that's collected doesn't actually get published, and actually it's what we really should be trying to publish it, so go for it.
And a big thank you to the EAPC for all of their excellent organisation, and we hope we'll be able to share the recordings with you if you want to listen back to either Catherine Walsh's or this one. And so thank you, and have a good day, everybody. Bye now.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everyone, for joining in and all the questions. Thank you.